right, folks, it is August of 2024, and we have a doozy of an episode today because there might be a new CUI executive order. NARA might not be the CUI executive agent any longer. It will have huge impacts on federal contractors, including defense contractors, especially if the Department of Defense were to somehow become the executive agent over the Controlled Unclassified Information Program. We're going to be talking about the single craziest document I have ever read in the extended universe of CMMC, Controlled Unclassified Information, NIST control stuff. It is quite the story. But first, some housekeeping. Very quickly, we have Secure the Dib coming up, if you're listening to this, our annual summertime webinar event, free to attend. We recently did an episode on the podcast with the great and powerful Daniel Akridge. We'll link that below. We'll link the registration page below so you can check that out. And just as a quick reminder, for those of you who are new to the show and heard about this podcast episode beforehand, please remember to like, please remember to subscribe. If you have the time, if you've gotten any value out of this show over the last almost 2 years, leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast and share it with your friends, because we save you the time from having to read these weird, obscure documents and connect all the dots that you didn't know needed to be connected. Save you a bunch of time, and hopefully you find that valuable. So if you could do that, it would help us out a bunch.
Jacob, there's a couple things that you said in that opening that really blew me away. One, the DoD may oversee the CUI program. And the reason why that blew me away is because CUI goes across all government agencies. So how could one individual agency oversee, that individual program? The second thing is that they've actually allowed us to do this show for almost 2 years.
Yeah, they have they have not pulled the plug just yet. But apparently we're getting into what feels like a spy novel. We're getting into this IG report that we're about to describe is so crazy to me. There are redacted footnotes in some boring old IG report about the oversight of the federal CUI program. Literally like multi-line footnotes that are blacked out because they can't be publicly disclosed. Like this is some sort of intelligence report or something. And we're talking about the boring old CUI program. There's craziness going on. There's a bunch of big pieces moving around, and we sort of easily lose perspective on the role that the overall federal CUI program plays, both helpful and hurtful, on things like cybersecurity requirements for defense contractors, verification programs like CMMC, how individual agencies like DoD or DHS and CISA do or do not play with the CUI program and its resulting requirements. So when things like this at the very top of the mountain start moving, the trickle-down effect will be significant. So we're going to go through the findings in this IG report, as well as connect some dots to some other obscure documents. And I think it's going to paint a very interesting picture for everybody. So we have a lot to get into. So let's just jump right into it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so between July of 2023 and March of 2024, so not that long ago, the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, their Office of the Inspector General, conducted a performance audit of NARA's Information Security Oversight Office, pronounced ISOO, ISOO, to determine the effectiveness of ISOO's Information Security Oversight Program as it relates to its role in establishing policy and oversight of the government-wide Controlled Unclassified Information Program between January of 2021 and June of 2023. So very recent audit of a very recent period of ISOO's management of the CUI program. And for those of you not familiar or just need to brush up a little bit, NARA is the executive agent, the EA, the executive agent of the federal-wide CUI program per Executive Order 13556, signed in 2010. It says the National Archives and Records Administration shall serve as the executive agent to implement this order and oversee agency actions to ensure compliance with this order. They are in charge of the federal-wide CUI program. They are in charge of overseeing each CUI program within each individual agency, which means they are upstream from the program that flows CUI, marked or unmarked, as we know, down to normal everyday contractors. Inside of the federal CUI regulation, which is known as 32 CFR 2002, that they had to go through rulemaking to create it. It's the CUI rule, the federal CUI rule. It says the executive agent implements the executive branch-wide CUI program and oversees federal agency actions to comply with the executive order. NARA has delegated this authority to the director of ISOO, right? So it's a team within NARA. ISOO's role within NARA is to promote the proper classification, protection, and declassification of classified information and controlled unclassified information by providing policy, guidance, and oversight of federal agencies. So they're the ones who are herding all of the cats. They're the ones in charge of oversight, policy, compliance of the federal agencies, who in turn then send those requirements down to folks like our listeners at home. So that's who NARA, that's who ISO is. This report has three major findings related to the executive agent's CUI responsibilities and the lack of them executing those responsibilities. And they have 5 big recommendations related to the CUI executive agent. This is very typical of IG reports. They'll find a bunch of stuff going on and they'll make a bunch of recommendations for improvement. That's the typical formula, unless there's some other major policy reform going on that has kind of flown under the radar regarding the largest government reform and largest information management government reform program in history. So they make all these recommendations in the report, but that's not really the main takeaway of this report. There's a lot of stuff around improving policy, procedure, oversight that ISOO should develop, but that's assuming that they stay in charge of the program at all, right? If all of a sudden there's some major policy reform and they're no longer in charge of the program, then those recommendations are not really the part to pay attention to. And apparently, even according to ISOO themselves and an interview with the former ISOO director who recently retired, it is a big assumption to think that ISOO will continue to be the executive agent in charge of the CUI program. So this is potentially the largest change to the federal CUI program since the executive order was written in 2010. ISOO's been in charge the entire time. So very quickly, as we get through that intro, posted about this on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. And the first question was, does this mean, literally the first question on my post was, does this mean that CMMC is dead on arrival? No, it does not. It actually means the opposite. The fact that there is major policy reform happening to the CUI program is a reinforcement that the CUI program would not be going away. But more importantly, CMMC, DFAR's cyber requirements exist independent of the CUI program. The original DoD DFAR cybersecurity rule was finalized in 2013 and created before the CUI program really existed in any meaningful way. And it was only because ISOO became the executive agent and they were standing up the federal CUI program that it disrupted DoD's own plans for protecting their information, having requirements on their contractors, and things like that.
So you're telling me that ISOO jumped in after we talked about like the DoD's individual CUI program and the FAR CUI rule, and how like the DoD jumped and they were like, this is taking too long. Let's take this into our own hands. We want our own program. We are establishing and setting up our own program before the FAR CUI rule. So that's how we got the DFARS rules and everything like that. So now you're telling me that the DoD had intentions to do this all along, and then ISOO was after the fact?
Yes. So we'll link to the now sort of mildly famous history of CMMC video where I cover this interaction. So basically simultaneously, right around 2010, the executive order gets written, hands NARA, ISOO the speaking stick. They're the executive agent in charge of the CUI program. At the same time, DoD had just gotten done being absolutely spanked by adversaries in cyberspace, and they needed to get control over their sensitive information that they're sending to contractors, right? The CUI program did not create controlled defense information. It didn't create controlled technical information. It just gave them a name, essentially, right? The DoD was already sending this information into the supply chain, and they were already had an interest in protecting that information. So literally at the same time that NARA and ISOO are standing up this federal CUI program, DoD is standing up their own requirements and assurance and all these other contract requirements. When that rule in 2013 was finalized, the first DFARS cybersecurity rule, NARA literally protested the rule and said, no. We're in charge of what's going on in terms of protection requirements for controlled unclassified information because we're the executive agent, not you. And that protest led to the next CMMC or the next DFARS rule in 2016. And it's the reason why NIST SP 800-171 is co-authored by NIST, NARA, and DoD when it was originally published, because DoD had an idea of what the requirements should be. NARA had an idea of what the requirements should be. NIST mediated what the requirements should be. And when three federal agencies love each other very much and get together, out pops something like NIST SP 800-171. So circa 2010 through 2016, they were writing rules. They were creating the federal CUI registry. They were writing NIST SP 800-171. They were doing webinars. They were updating the registry. I mean, they were just firing on all cylinders, managing, creating, and overseeing the federal CUI program.
All right. So excuse me if I just jump out of the scope of the conversation for a second. But so one thing that you brought up there is that you said that that's why NARA and the DoD co-authored 800-171, right? Revision 2. Well, revision 2, they were still included in that. When we got to revision 3, the
original one, yeah.
And then now that we've gotten to revision 3, DoD only gets a hug and a hand wave, right?
Yeah, and NARA is not even involved, which is really getting to.
It's kind of telling, but here's where the problem lies out with that is that we have these executive orders, we have these cybersecurity plans, we have national strategies that all say that we need to unify these things. And what you're telling me now is that the CUI program, which was implemented executive branch wide, is now going to be implemented maybe agency wide, governed by the agencies, which then offers more opportunity for what? Variance, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what the IG report talks about. So let's get into just to put a pin on this point, right?
Okay.
DoD was always sending information into the supply chain. They always were concerned about the protection requirements for that information. They can always stand up a program to have better assurance and verification that it is being protected. If there is a federal program that gives a name to the categories of information, if there's a federal program that gives somebody oversight of what all the agencies are doing, that can exist or it cannot exist. Doesn't really matter. DoD can still do DFARS, NIST requirements, CMMC with a CUI program or without a CUI program. So just want to stress that. If the next executive order nukes the CUI program from orbit, that does not stop the DoD from doing what they're doing. It just is the thing that gives a name to the type of information that DoD is protecting, when before they didn't really have a name for it. So just wanted to stress that at the top here, because when we go through it, it's just a parade of, it's just a disaster in terms of what's going on inside ISOO over the CUI program. Okay, so to summarize the findings in this report, the federal CUI program oversight has been almost completely stopped for the last 2 years. Right around 2022, summer of 2022, all oversight and activity of the federal CUI program basically came to a screeching halt inside of ISOO. And according to this IG report, ISOO has not actively performed or fully documented 6 of the 12 responsibilities of the CUI executive agent to meet the requirements of the executive order. No CUI advisory council meetings have been held since June of 2022. No support was provided documenting the timely approval of categories and subcategories of CUI in the registry. No support was provided documenting the timely review and approval of agency policies implementing the CUI rule to ensure consistency with the executive order, the CUI program rule, the CUI registry within individual agency programs. No updates have been made to the CUI registry changelog since September of 2022. Limited support was provided documenting the procedures, guidance, and instructions for oversight and agency self-inspection programs, making sure that individual agency programs are doing what they need to do. Sound familiar? Anybody? No support was provided documenting the timely consideration and resolution of disputes, complaints, and suggestions about the CUI program from entities outside the government. How many times have we talked about it on this podcast? The executive agent is in charge of the federal CUI program. NIST SP 800-171 is the federal-wide standard for protecting CUI. Somebody needs to define the ODPs inside 171. It should probably be the executive agent, unless, as we've talked about on the podcast, NARA literally was asleep at the wheel. NARA really, for the last 2 years, hasn't been doing anything with the CUI program. We weren't just yelling at the clouds. They actually weren't. They weren't listening. They weren't doing anything.
For like the past, since Revision 3 was released, you've been calling for NARA to be the people to
so we were knocking on the right door.
I don't know. I don't know if that's such a good idea now. I don't think that they have a full grasp of what needs to get done here. Everything that's oversight there looks like things that would be...
It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. We were knocking on the right door, but there's no one home. And it gets worse. It gets worse. ISOO did not formally document the processes for the identification of agencies to be included in the annual CUI data call. They did not capture the formal procedures and levels of staffing involved or required to manage the program. ISOO did not have written policies and procedures to support the identification of the agencies even subject to the CUI regulation. They did not have the policies and procedures to support the individual ISOO personnel who are responsible for actually doing this job.
Did ISOO ask if the policies and procedures were required?
Fun fact, ISOO, quote, instead, this is a quote, instead, ISOO relied on institutional memory and past practices. Let's just pause here and admire this object lesson for everyone subject to the requirements that ISOO collaborated on creating that focus on formal documented policies and procedures, relying on institutional memory and past practices rather than formalized documented policies and procedures over what you're responsible for, create some specific problems, whether you're a federal government oversight agency or whether you're a small contractor or anyone in between. The same problems occur when it's just in your head. For instance, as a result of all of this, ISOO cannot respond to external requests and regulatory oversight. ISOO cannot timely respond to external requests regarding any of the CUI activities that are being performed. Similarly, a defense contractor might not be able to respond to external requests and regulatory oversights to prove that they're doing what they need to do, which is the entire reason that CMMC exists in the first place. ISOO cannot determine adequate resources for CUI processes. They cannot effectively identify and justify the resources needed, such as personnel, funding, technology, or support for effective oversight. ISOO cannot define risks associated with CUI or substantiate oversight and performance management activities are being performed at all. This is the most diplomatic way of saying they can't prove that they're doing anything. Here's what the report says. ISOO is unable to...
Oh, hold on. I thought you were saying that those are limitations on what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do.
These are the
no, you're saying that these are things that they're not doing it.
They can't do these things. They can't respond to external requests. They can't prove they're doing anything. They can't manage it. They don't know the risks. They can't identify anything. They have no control or oversight.
Did they know they were supposed to be doing this?
Oh, yeah. So this is the crazy part. So we're really admiring...
Are you sure they knew they were supposed to be doing this?
So the problem gets pretty crazy here, but the interesting part about this story is not just that ISOO threw up their hands and they said, we're not doing anything. The crazy part is the fact that ISOO is like, yeah, it is like this and it ought to change. Not, yeah, it's bad and we should still be in charge of it. That's the real twist of the story. But let's just indulge ourselves in the problem a little bit more, right?
So it's like having a kid and then saying, you know what, I really shouldn't have had this thing anyways. After 2 years, when the kid's like is struggling, that's a terrible thing to think about. But realistically, that's what it is. They gave birth to this kid, right? And then realized that taking care of a kid is a lot harder than it's supposed to be, and they weren't able to change the diapers to produce the formula to wake up for the feedings.
A dog, a Jeep Wrangler. There's all sorts of situations that people get themselves into that they probably weren't prepared for in terms of the actual upkeep.
But that's what happened here, right? They were like,
sort of.
They were forced on it. I'm sorry. I'm getting worked up now. Let's chill for a second.
Let's get to the point where we'll hear from the ISOO director directly, and he'll explain how this situation happened, right? So just to reiterate how diplomatic this statement is, they say ISOO is unable to effectively demonstrate its examination of risks associated with the CUI oversight and performance management processes in an electronic format suitable to substantiate oversight and performance management processes occur. That's a very wordy government IG way of saying they can't prove they're doing anything.
Right.
They can't prove in a substantial way in an acceptable format that anything's happening at all. So it's really bad. One of the other things they can't do is they can't effectively plan for contingencies. And this was the part that I thought was the most salient for small businesses that are listening to this story, who are part of this extended universe. Because the team in ISOO is so small, at sometimes barely more than a dozen people for managing multiple distinct missions, not just CUI. There might have been a handful of people at any given time in charge of overseeing the entire federal government CUI program. They say that because they don't have this stuff in place, because they don't have this management oversight structure internally, they're unable to effectively plan for contingencies. Because they're relying on institutional memory and past practice, they're unable to deal with unexpected resource constraints, such as employee turnover. Literally, there were so few people in ISOO managing this problem that when one of them would transfer out of the office, it would just stop because there was no one else who could do the work. Sound like a similar situation to people trying to manage your IT, your security, your compliance? If that person leaves and it's not documented, if you didn't comment your code and then another developer comes in 6 months later after that person leaves, you're up a creek. You're up a creek. And it doesn't matter who it is. Business, small business, big agency, small agency, exact same problem over and over again.
So that when you place too much responsibility on your resources that extend past their threshold of acceptance, right? That's when things start to suffer. That's when things start to get ignored and stuff like that. So it wasn't a case of we did all the things to have a kid and had a kid and we're ignoring it. We were given this kid that was left on our doorstep and we don't know how to take care of a kid. We don't have the capability to take care of a kid. And now the kid's suffering.
Yeah. And the ISOO director sort of talks about the culture of government and Congress giving agencies these extra responsibilities without really thinking through what that means in terms of funding, resources, more team members.
A 12-person team is managing the entire CUI program. That might be good if that was their only responsibility. Might be good. Might be good.
Yeah, exactly.
Not the other things that ISOO has to handle. So now I get it. Now I feel a little bit like an a-hole because I went a little hard at the beginning because I was like, nobody's doing anything. But I guess that's the importance of reports, right?
Yeah, and this is where we're going to get to the part that I think is the valuable part. So there's just this litany of things going wrong. Everything's going wrong. They're not doing anything. They haven't done anything for 2 years. Everything's bad. Everything's terrible. Everything's on fire. And you're like, man, these guys really dropped the ball. These guys are incompetent. They're terrible. They don't care or any of that. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. It is completely stopped and on ice, like by design for two main reasons, as are pointed out in this report. The two reasons that ISOO management experienced challenges executing the responsibilities of the executive agent. One, resource constraints. Now, when you read IG reports as often as I do, you'll notice that there's a very common pattern. Literally every management response from everyone ever says,
we don't have enough.
Why are things so bad? We don't have enough resources, right? In this case, they're not actually lying. In this case, they really didn't have the resources. We'll get to that part later. The more interesting part is policy reform. The second reason why these issues are happening, the second reason why nothing has been occurring for the last 2 years is policy reform. What does that mean? So this is where the report gets kind of spooky, right? So they say it gets spooky because I'm reading the footnotes, I'm doing my thing, happy as a clam, and then there's multiple lines of footnotes that are redacted with black lines, like intelligence reports. They're like intelligence dossiers where you're blacking out and redacting.
I got to ask the question: what would you give right now to know what's behind those black lines?
Oh, man, the keys to my broken down Jeep Wrangler. Immediately, you can have it. Just tell me I want to know what's behind this redacted point. But let's frame this.
Well, it's a surprise, Jacob, because if you look on your desk, no, that'd be great. Be a reveal. Jacob breaks out in tears.
It's just amazing to me that something so sensitive would be included in a IG report on the boring old CUI program. So let's just walk through these very quickly. So they say in the report, the issuance of the White House National Security Council's June 2022 memorandum fundamentally changed the implementation landscape of the CUI program. So for those of you that don't remember, it was barely a blip on the radar. In June of 2022, the National Security Council, the top of the mountain, issued the memorandum initiating a process to review information management and classification policies, which established an information management and classification interagency policy committee to identify revisions or replacements of Executive Order 13556, Controlled Unclassified Information, as well as the Executive Order for Classified Information. The National Security Council brought the agencies together and said, we either need to review, rescind, or replace the CUI Executive Order. That's a huge deal.
So that lines up with the time that
is exactly when ISOO stopped doing anything.
Yeah, okay.
The CUI program was 2022, right? Between June and September, everything came to a screeching halt, right? Because of this memorandum. And they say the memorandum complicated the executive agent, ISOO. It complicated their responsibilities until the conclusion of the NSC's policy reform process that will lead to a new CUI executive order anticipated in 2024. This is where can we get the inception for new CUI executive order in 2024? This is not an old report. This was released.
It's 2024 now.
It's 2024 right now,
and there's only 4 months left in it.
This report came out in June, and the period of this report was like the end of 2023 to the beginning of 2024. And this footnote says there will be a new CUI executive order anticipated in 2024. What is happening? What's going on?
Wait a minute. No. This isn't real, right? You're making this up? Is this a test?
All of this stuff, the registry, NARA, the CUI programs, the weird definitions, the changes to DFARS rulemaking, NIST SP 800-171, resulting programs like CMMC, fights between agencies like DHS and DoD over how to manage these things. All of this stuff is the result of the original executive order in 2010, and now we might get a new CUI executive order in 2024.
Bro, so I'm not trying to assume, but I just want to make sure. Like this report was taking place as rulemaking was taking place, and I'm sure that these organizations talk to each other, right? Like,
oh yeah,
right. I don't want to be ignorant and assume that they do, you know. So you're telling me that the one thing that we can depict from this, and it's kind of like what was stated earlier, is that if this executive order was in the works already, it has to be in the works. We just don't write them overnight, right? They've got to get spun
a new executive order is a big deal. And
rulemaking was taking place, and they were having conversations together, then there shouldn't be anything fundamentally sound that changes about the program from the executive order. So we can kind of delineate what the executive order is going to say for the most part.
Theoretically. Now, the big part of the executive order for these purposes is NARA is in charge of the program. So if there's a new CUI executive order, then the CUI executive agent would be the same, right? Maybe not. Let's keep going in the footnotes here. So they say that this interagency
is NARA. Hold on, is NARA caught out? I didn't mean to interrupt you. I did mean to interrupt you. Actually, I intentionally interrupted you so you would stop talking. Now it's all spinning now, right? So if NARA is called out in 32 CFR,
yeah, they wrote the rule because they're the ones in charge.
So wait an effing minute. If NARA and ISOO no longer are the executive agents, we have to write the rule again, right?
Maybe. We'll have to see.
What the F is happening?
Let's get through. So they talk about this interagency. So basically, mom and dad show up.
Please, no new rules.
The National Security Council kicks down the door and they say, everybody stop. We're going to look at the executive order for classified information. We're going to look at the executive order for controlled and classified information. And ISOO basically says, be my guest. No problem. So they go on to say, per discussion with ISOO management, the CUI Advisory Council meetings, all that stuff that they weren't doing for 2 years, were halted to participate in the National Security Council Interagency Policy Committee with other CUI stakeholders. On September 7th, 2022, ISO issued CUI Notice 2022-01, Executive Agent Guidance regarding White House National Security Memorandum, dated June of 2022, and then everything stops on September 9th, and nothing happens after that for basically 2 years. What's interesting is they say ISOO management stated anticipated concerns surrounding agencies' abilities to implement or suspend CUI program efforts were shared with the National Security Council immediately following the issuance of the memorandum. So the National Security Council says, okay, here's a memo. We're all getting together for a group hug. We're going to figure this out. ISOO goes, we're not doing anything anymore.
We're not hugging you right now.
We have major concerns about what's going on. Please, this has to change. Please take this. You have to get this out of here. We don't want anything to do with it. So this was not ISOO just sort of like going to the beach and shirking their responsibilities. As soon as the National Security Council came up, they said, no problem, boss. We'll pause everything. You can figure out who needs to take it.
And these are the concerns we have. I wonder if the concerns that they had were that this whole program is going to go and nothing's going to happen to it. It's just going to collect dust.
Well, I don't necessarily think those were the concerns, but what's even more interesting than that is the other agencies' reactions at this same time. So they said some agencies resisted continued coordination and implementation oversight pending the resolution of the National Security Council Interagency Policy Committee process. So the National Security Council says, we got to review what's going on. ISOO says, we're not doing nothing. The rest of the agency said, we're not doing anything. Everybody stop, which is why we've spent the last 2 years being like, what the hell is going on? Where are the definitions? Where are the new categories? Where are the blog posts? Where are the webinars? Where is the guidance? What is happening? And this is the evidence to show you that DoD can go about, any agency can go about their own volition to issue their requirements, have assurance requirements over making sure that those cyber requirements are implemented independent of what's going on with the CUI program and the intricacies of oversight of the CUI program. But this is a crazy situation. For the last 2 years, the CUI program has basically been rudderless. Nothing's been going on pending the outcome of this Interagency Policy Committee session. And according to this report, the outcome of that Interagency Policy Committee is a new CUI Executive Order. Like you said, we might be able to speculate what's going on in terms of that CUI Executive Order, but there's nothing really in the report that talks about it specifically. It just so happens that the director of ISOO during this time period, Mark Bradley, a highly decorated and very well respected government civil servant who spent a career at the CIA, Department of Justice. This guy's an author. He's a Rhodes Scholar. This is a serious person. His last job in the government was being the director of ISOO. And NARA does a great job of, being the archive of the United States government. So they did a long oral interview with Mark Bradley in January of 2024, after he retired in the summer of 2023. I would encourage everyone to read it because not only is it interesting from this perspective, like this niche of what's going on at the CUI program, what does that mean for contractors and things like that, but he has a lot of insight into classification, declassification. That's a big topic in the news right now in terms of former government officials holding on to classified information and what that should mean and what the policy of the government ought to be. And he's seen a lot. He's done a lot. I read his ISOO director reports, annual reports to the president every year. The man is a published author of many historical novels. They're wonderful to read. You should read the entire interview. But here are the parts that jump out from the interview about his perspective as the ISOO director on the CUI program during the time that this change would be happening as a result of the National Security Council's IPC process. Here's some quotes. This is Mark Bradley, do not think ISOO should be the executive agent of the Controlled and Classified Information Program. That was a role we never should have taken on. ISOO has oversight. It doesn't build programs, especially ones that are as large and complex as the CUI program. We don't administer programs. We oversee them. That function is in our name. The Controlled Unclassified Information Program, I don't think anybody knew what that was going to be. I euphemistically called it ISOO's Vietnam, that we got into it and we couldn't get out of it. The program dwarfs the classified program. There's much more controlled unclassified information than there is classified information. Nobody in the executive branch knew how much there was when the program started. Nobody knew the categories. Nobody knew how complex it was. It was being marked in many different ways. There was a need to do something with it, but I don't think that it should have been ISOO who should have gotten the ticket to go ahead and build the program. Again, we oversee, we don't build, and that program took a lot of resources, especially during my tenure. And a lot of the time, many agencies just didn't want to do it, just refused to implement the program. Then he goes on, and he says, now, this is the connection to the executive order part. He says, now it's being re-examined to be simplified. And I pushed very hard for ISOO to get out of the role of the executive agent to be more in an oversight role, but not be the office charged with implementing the program. That never made any sense to me at all. Never. But that was, I think, because nobody else wanted to do it. And so it was just, okay, who do you give it to? Well, of course, ISOO, right? It does everything else, and it just killed us. It just killed us resource-wise. Literally a team of 12 people who have the entire classified information of the federal government to oversee, as well as like 2 or 3 other distinct missions, just got tossed the CUI program to stand it up from scratch. It's amazing that they did what they did. It's amazing that they created the CUI registry. It's amazing that they got through the rulemaking process. It's incredible that they were doing as much stuff as they were doing, but 1 or 2 people leave, a couple agencies decide that they don't want to play ball, a couple different priorities change, couple government shutdowns go by, and pretty soon it's been 10 years, you haven't made a lot of progress, and then boom, the National Security Council shows up and everybody goes, we got to change something. We got to
I mean, there's a bunch of, in that impact quote right there.
ISOO's Vietnam?
Right. That, first of all, like, solid.
What a quote.
As a budding wordsmith myself, I would like to, obviously take the moment to give the flowers for it. And absolutely, but ISOO's calling it Vietnam and saying that it's basically something that we got into. We didn't want to get into it. We got into it. And we can't figure out how to get out of it. And the worst part about it is that the people that we're into it with, the other agencies that we're like, we're trying to administer this program, make sure that they do it. They're just like, no, thanks. We don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I would encourage everybody to read the interview document, which will link below, the interview transcript in full. Some very interesting notes. Not only does he talk about how small the team was and how strapped they were, he also talks about his relationship with the people who were on the National Security Council, who he went to and said, we should not be in charge of this. Do not make us in charge of this. We never should have been handed this program. Please make this somebody else's responsibility who have the resources and the time. The person who was in charge of the National Security Council Interagency Policy Committee used to work for him and spent a long time working at ISOO. So when they show up and he says, yeah, I told them we shouldn't be in charge of it, it's not like he's petitioning some person he's never met. They're coworkers. Not only are they coworkers, this was a person who spent a lot of years and knows exactly the constraints of working at ISOO. So when you hear in the footnote of the IG report, oh, there's a new executive order coming up, and ISOO expressed immediate dissatisfaction with being in charge of the program, and then you read Mark Bradley's interview, and he was like, it was like being stuck in freaking Vietnam. I have a feeling that CUI executive order is going to make somebody else the executive agent. Now, NARA ISOO might still be in an oversight role, but they might not be in the day-to-day like compliance executive agent role. And that begs the question, if it's not going to be ISOO NARA, who would it be?
That's a good way to end the show.
Who might it be? Who might be an agency who, when all the other agencies were digging in their heels and writing snarky reports about how the CUI program was pointless and inefficient and dumb, all the other agencies that were just not participating, all the other agencies that weren't responding to data calls, all the other agencies that had no trouble not even thinking about it, not even lifting a finger to help contribute to NIST SP 800-171. Who was the one agency throughout that entire time period who seemingly had their back? Who was the one agency who has furthered CUI program requirements and protections when everybody else was abandoning them in Vietnam? Yes, Jason in the back?
I would say it's probably the one agency that has experience in Vietnam.
It's the DOD. It's the Department of Defense. And I don't want to name any names. If anybody wants to do some internet sleuthing and some open source research, you can figure it out for yourself. I'll tell you this. There's not a lot of people who worked at ISOO during the time period when ISOO was at the peak of their CUI executive agent powers. Those people went on to other government agency jobs running agency programs. And then right around the time that the National Security Council process concluded and a new executive order is being drafted, those people changed jobs again. Do you know where they took jobs at? The Department of Defense.
Okay.
The Department of Defense. Now, I'm not going to name who they are. You all can figure that out if you want to. But there's a lot of smoke here. There's a lot of smoke here.
I always struggle with the dramatic pause. Like when you hit the dramatic pause, like, is the time now? Do I go now? Go now? Go now? And then you answer.
I'm a very dramatic person. This is a very dramatic story.
So I mean, but it is, but because now that you've gone to 6 degrees of separation with, you know, it kind of factors in, like they didn't want it. ISOO didn't want it. People left ISOO. They've transitioned. Now they have new, they worked on this program and now they have new positions within the one organization, the one federal agency, which actually accepted the program, that jumped on board and is the furthest along. Yeah. Absolutely. Actually, realistically, further. Yeah. Right. Like they were like, you know what? You guys are taking too long. Let us finish this out real quick. They're further along in the finishing. This is now, holy cow, dude.
Yeah. And remember, one of the weirdest things that's happened over the last few years is we have the NARA CUI registry and we've got the DOD CUI registry. And everybody's always been like, why is there a DOD CUI registry? You're not in charge of the program unless they're about to be in charge of the program.
That's crazy, dude. Once you start putting together the different pieces and you start realizing, like, yes, it totally logically makes sense. At the beginning of this episode, I was like, it can't be the DOD. The reason it can't be the DOD is because it can't be funneled into one agency. It can't be funneled into one agency or it can't be the responsibility of each individual agency to carry out their own CUI programs, because then there's variance and contractors don't just work in DOD or et cetera.
Yeah.
Now, if the DOD oversees it, I mean, we've always talked about it being the canary in the coal mine. Realistically, they were just planning to overthrow the government, right? Like,
well, yeah. Apparently, instead of the canary in the coal mine, it's the canary in the canary farm, and the DoD is the canary farmer. So they talk about
student becoming teacher.
They talk about in the interview very briefly. He sort of alludes to different situations, not necessarily in reference to the CUI program, but he alludes to different situations where DoD used to be the executive agent of things like the classified program, and other people were in advisory roles advising them. This is not an unprecedented situation by any means. So ultimately, right, what does this mean? You still got to implement 800-171, and somebody's still going to show up and assess you under CMMC. But this is just one of those things that's going to open the aperture of your understanding of what's going on in the broader universe of how these things trickle down to you eventually having to like implement MFA, right? Like how these big machinations of the government sort of lock together and work and change over time. Eventually you get things like executive orders, and then that spurns rules, and then rules spurn contract requirements spurn dollars that you have to spend and investment decisions that you have to make. So these are not things that people should necessarily stay up at night worrying about who the executive agent is going to be. Just know that this is not a dead program. It seemed like a dead program for 2 years. I wouldn't blame anybody for thinking that it was a dead program. Apparently, behind the scenes and under the hood, there's a lot of stuff moving. And I think that it's not that much of a stretch, even though this is still speculation at this point, that DOD might pick up the reins and then they're going to be in charge, which would, I mean, that would be, one, it would probably make things a lot simpler, but what a change. What a historic change in this whole saga of CUI, CMMC, NIST requirements, DFARS, so on and so forth. I couldn't believe it. And when they're talking about this national security policy memorandum, they redact the footnotes explaining the memorandum. Why is that a confidential memo? Why is that a classified?
Do you think it's because it's not released yet?
I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe that's it, because maybe it's things that, maybe it's extractions from that actual executive order they were talking about or whatever.
It was just so strange that it's like this big, it's not like one line. It's not like somebody's name. It's like a big block that's redacted. And I was like, what?
So what are the reasons? It would have to be involved in some sort of investigation, or like it could be a part of some sort of legal, it could be a part of an executive order that's not released yet.
Justification. It could be the justification for why, like,
or
the national security.
Or GAO was like, if I put these black lines in here, Jacob is going to go absolutely insane until he finds out.
Some guy in the ISOO's office like, hey, watch this. You want to see that guy's head explode on that podcast? Well, here's the thing is, the National Security Council is concerned with some very high-level strategic national security considerations, and they decided that they needed to revisit these two executive orders, and then something about that information in their memo is redacted. So it's probably pretty spicy underneath those redaction lines. I can't even imagine. I don't know. It's a scintillating mystery to know what's under those redacted lines. Maybe one day we'll figure it out. Either way, regardless of what's under those redaction lines, we could be getting a new CUI executive order and a new CUI executive agent literally at any time. It's 2024. It's the back half of 2024.
And they adjourn, right? They adjourn for the year too.
Well, I mean, yeah.
And hold on. 2024 calendar year or 2024 government year? Because that makes it even more spicy.
If I had to pick, the poetic decision would be to do it in November, because that would be when the original CUI executive order came out.
Aligned again. Only been doing 2 years worth of shows together. Thank God we're on the same page.
2 years. Yeah, it would be pretty crazy, but it could happen at any moment, and that could cause major changes to the other agencies' CUI. Yeah.
Program. What if that's the 2024? They're saying that the executive order released in 2024, it ends by the end of the government year, the government calendar year.
That would be,
which happens before the election.
Yeah.
Wow,
dude. We don't know. It's pretty crazy. The National Security Council doesn't just take things lightly, right? And this was a process.
Well, I mean, the National Security Council, I hope they take things seriously, Jacob.
Yeah, and it was a process, a review and revision process with multiple agencies and stakeholders that took 2 years with, senior government people who are very serious and very qualified, and they know exactly what they're doing. I mean, this is a big deal. So the whole story is just really crazy. It's a big step forward in the story of CUI and CMMC and this whole like Lord of the Rings length story at this point. It's something to know about for your broader reference, something to keep an eye on. I know I would have been completely floored if I hadn't seen this IG report and read these footnotes, if just one day a new CUI executive order comes up, because no one's talked about it. There's no news stories. There's no panel discussions. There's been no information about this at all.
Can you imagine if you're one of those people for the past 2 years that's written an email to NARA that's like, hey, about the CUI category, like, it's just,
I wonder what their inbox looks like. They have it.
Yeah, and so that kind of spurs what my talking point here is now when there is a new executive agent appointed, or if it is NARA remains, if ISOO remains with it, is there now that hill that they got to get out of? They got to dig out of all this mountain of work, or is it we're starting?
I don't know.
Fresh, because no they're simplifying the program. They're changing. I don't know. This strap in, okay?
Yeah, it's definitely something interesting to watch moving into the back half of the year.
If you thought the election was going to be the most interesting thing happening this fall, you are completely wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure that this definitely outranks the election in a lot of people's minds, but it's something to pay attention to. Something to know about. Definitely at least skim Mark Bradley's interview. It's fascinating for multiple different reasons. The IG report is also quite interesting as well, but they basically talk about all these takeaways that ISOO should implement to reform their role. That's just probably not going to happen. They're probably going to give it to somebody else. So who knows what's going to happen? I think it's going to be DoD. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments below. Do you think it should be a DoD? Do you think it's going to be DoD, whether it should be somebody else? What should the answer be? what would make the program actually get back up and running and improve the program. I don't know.
I vote for the wild card. Let it be transportation. See you next week, folks.
See you next week.